one of the most important things is training your brain to go into that state where you can do that connection. So if you're familiar with the way brain waves work, I'm not going to teach on that at all, but there's alpha and beta and gamma and theta, and your brain works differently in each of those stages. So when you're flying an F-18, you're in a massively high attention span mode where you're probably not going to be like doing God talks. You know what I'm saying? But when you sit down and control your breathing and start to focus just a little bit, you can get yourself into a space where you can do that. And when you start to do it more often, you can often shift it like shifting a gear on a car. It used to take me like 20 or 30 minutes really to kind of slow down. And now, because I recognize what one state is and another one, sometimes I can just go whoop right into that state for maybe 5 minutes and then just come back out again. That's all just about training your brain. Right? So the breathing exercise I did this morning was maybe like 8 or 9 minutes, but you could tell even as you were doing that, I'd come back in and be like, okay, just breathe through your nose. You're like, oh man, I was thinking about something else. It's just part of the training. And eventually you'll get to where you can do that just a little bit better. But the more you can do that, the better you can focus. And later, and when I do this next exercise, I'm going to do the breathing exercise just a little bit differently. You'll see it's a little bit of a different angle on it where you're just going to focus on different parts of your body. And again, it's just a focusing exercise. It's not anything like amazing, putting your awareness on your feet and your knees and your hips and your belly and your chest and your back and your head. It's just that you're training your mind to focus on a certain place, and when that happens, all those other distractions start to go away, and all of a sudden, you're now receptive. There's science behind all this. If you've studied the pineal gland, the pineal gland is part of the superconscious receptor system. And scientists are actually starting to see that. And I had a car accident in a Marriott van like 4 years ago. The driver started screaming, oh, blank. He started screaming profanities, and then we hit a railing in snow in Atlanta, where it never snows, except for that day. So I hit my head. I didn't get knocked out, but I just felt really off. And there's a brain researcher I know, Dr. Daniel Amen. You ever heard of Dr. Daniel Amen? Change your brain, change your life. So I went to his clinic, and you spend 2 days at his clinic, and they basically... they do all these scans of your brain. You do all these little tests and stuff. It's very comprehensive, and you literally don't even meet a doctor until the end of the second day. You go through this whole battery of tests, and so you find out later, at the very end, how your brain's working. So finally, I sat down with this doctor. You spend 2 hours. I had 2 hours in the session with this doctor, and she has all the reports in front of her, and she looks at my brain, and she's been looking at it for like an hour before I even came in. And she looks at all of it, and she looked up at me and said, the first thing you should know is you have the most powerful brain of anyone I've ever met. Well, that's what I heard, okay? It's not the exact words that she used. I think what she said was, I've noticed there's some trauma. Sometimes you hear, you know what I'm saying? Like you hear things, and then, So anyway, so no, she goes, well, here's your brain scan, and here's where I had a concussion earlier when I was a kid. And they just show you some areas that may have damage and how to rehabilitate those. And then she says, but what were you doing? So you're doing one where you were like working on a computer, and then you're just doing one where you're just sitting there with your eyes closed. And she goes, what were you doing when you had your eyes closed? And I said, well, I was praying. And she said, well, we told you to do nothing. And I go, well, I'm just sitting there. And when I ever just sit someplace, I'm usually just praying. And she's like, well, that's not nothing. And I'm like, well, okay. You should have told me not to pray either, because that's what I do when I sit there with my eyes closed, So she goes, look, and you could see, it was. I should just put this in my slides from now on. It was a picture of from the top of my brain, and there was like this, and it was completely lit up around that area, which is called your pineal gland. For years, researchers had no idea what the pineal gland did. They had no idea. And then they realized that it moderates melatonin and serotonin, and then all of a sudden they realized that when people are in a heightened spiritual awareness state, either through prayer or meditation, the pineal gland goes and turns on. But with a lot of people, because of diet and neglect, the pineal gland begins to calcify. Remember what I said? Sometimes people turn their subconscious on and never turn it back on again. So actually, like 8 years ago, I just started praying, God, just clean out my pineal gland, right? And then like 3 years later, I'm in this thing. And the lady's like, look at your pineal gland, right? And the reason my pineal gland was like, was because I had spent a lot of time exercising that through God Talks, right? So if you want to get better at communicate, remember I said all this stuff feels really spiritual, and it is, but it's also based in simply brain. If you want to get really, really good at this, just do it. You know what I'm saying? Like if you want big biceps, do curls. If you want big legs, do squats. If you want big prayer muscles, do prayer through God Talks, and your pineal gland will get stronger. It's scientifically based. It's amazing when you think about it, isn't it? It actually puts it kind of back in your hands, right? It makes it feel a little less like, oh, that's for like the really spiritual, super spiritual people or whatever. You know what I'm saying? Because sometimes the super spiritual people are the worst at this. The people who make religion a business, sometimes, like you talk to some pastors, I mentored some pastors who don't pray at all. They're working spiritual stuff all day. Why would they do that later on? And I've talked to people who are atheists. Remember, I said there was an atheist who came to me with two pages of notes. About 2 years later, she was a client, so I was in touch with her. But 2 years later, I said, hey, Francine, are you still talking to God? And she said, yeah, every Friday. I said, you're still an atheist? She goes, yeah, I think I'm still an atheist. I said, but every Friday, how long? About an hour, from 9 to 10. I said, every Friday from 9 to 10, you talk to God. And you're still an atheist, right? Yeah, I think I'm still an atheist. I said, Francine, you pray more than most Christians. I know. You know how many few people pray for an hour a week? She's sitting there talking to God. But she doesn't even know it's praying. She's just having a God talk, right? It's fundamentally what it is, right? You talk, God talks. You talk, God talks. It's very simple. It's like what you would do with a friend. Isn't it interesting that he calls you a friend? You know what I'm saying? Like sometimes we treat this relationship. You have people who are like, oh, I'm just a sheep. If you want to do that, that's fine. If you want to be a sheep. But he also said you can be a friend. And I like friends better than being a sheep. You know what I'm saying? You can relate to God however you decide to relate to God. You know? There's a lot of friend, brother. You can be brother if you want. He says lover, which I think is crazy because I always look at him as God the Father. I'm like, I don't think about it that way. But you know what I'm saying? However you want to do it. It's really fun how you want to do it, okay?